Coming up on the Threat Status Podcast, we talk to Steve Pykett, the CEO of Fairbanks Morse, about America's naval edge over its adversaries, the importance of ending supply chain reliance on China, and how the defense industry sees President Trump's proposal for a new golden fleet of battleships. And then we break down the latest from Iran, the attempts to jam Starlink internet, and why the Pentagon is making a $1 billion investment in a new private company to make solid rocket motors. Don't forget to go to WashingtonTimes.com and sign up for the daily Threat Status newsletter. Hello and welcome to the Threat Status Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wolfgang, national security correspondent at the Washington Times. I'm joined this week by John Seward, defense and national security correspondent here at the Times. Good to have you back again this week, John. We just spent some time at the Service Navy Association's annual symposium in Arlington, Virginia, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in the show. And we have a great exclusive interview coming up with Steve Pykett, the CEO of Fairbanks Morse, a company that makes engines and all kinds of other components for vessels for the Navy, Coast Guard, and Marine Corps. Steve and I talked at the Surface Navy Association Symposium. But before we get there, John, first things first, as always, what's on your radar right now?
You know, it was interesting at the Surface Navy Association's symposium. There was a lot of discussion around Golden Fleet, right? There's a whole new push to have a new battleship in the Navy fleet. The one challenge, though, is it seemed like not a lot of folks knew how that was actually going to get executed, whether that was from a budgetary perspective, a shipbuilding perspective. There's a lot of questions right now around the efficiencies in that department. I mean, Palantir actually just got a big contract to actually put artificial intelligence into shipbuilding, try to build some efficiency in the process. And there's also massive recruiting campaigns. Our own Mike Glenn, he wrote a nice article about how the Department of Labor is actually inserting some cash, right, into creating more workforce for shipbuilding. And so as all of those problems are happening, now you're layering on top yet another platform. So there's a lot of conversation about it, but it left us with more questions than answers. That's the first thing that's at the top of my mind right now.
You know, it's interesting. I heard that from industry sources as well. There was kind of this mix of, I think, sort of excitement on one hand, because let's be honest, this could be a business opportunity for a lot of the folks who were at the Surface Navy Association event. But also, I think, Navy officials made clear, as you kind of referenced there, John, that they see the Trump class of battleships, the Golden Fleet, as something that would be kind of layered on top of what they already have, not necessarily replacing the existing fleet. I think that's a little bit of a distinction from the way President Trump, I think, kind of initially framed this when he rolled it out a few weeks ago. It seems the Navy, as you, I think, rightly point out, is looking at this as yet another thing that we're going to have. Maybe that's good, maybe that's bad, but it is more of a responsibility, more work for folks who are kind of, stretched thin in some ways already.
That's right. And I think one of the things that got brought up during the conference was, look, there is an understanding that the Arleigh class of destroyer is pushed to the breaking point, right? It has been sort of bolted on with a lot of different configurations, and there is a need for something to fill the gap. But there's just not a lot of solution right now, and as far as like the actual military industry to build that ship.
So look, I mean, the Golden Fleet obviously here is on everybody's mind this week. And, as I said, I think it injected a bit of energy into the event. But there was something else going on here this week, John, leading into that event that I'm curious to get your take on. Because a lot of folks were talking about this with me, and that was this Pentagon $1 billion direct-to-supplier investment into a spinoff company from L3 Harris. Essentially, the way this works is L3 Harris Missile Solutions business is now going to become a separate company as part of this deal, and will produce the kinds of solid rocket motors needed for advanced missile systems, Tomahawks, THAADs. You've written about this in the past, John. That new company is going to have an IPO, an initial public offering, later this year, which means the government, or I guess the taxpayers technically, will be shareholders of this new company. Now, as somebody who just binge watched Succession for the third or fourth time, I'm very into boardroom politics and shareholder drama right now. So this is kind of right in my wheelhouse at this moment. And of course, listeners to this show and readers of Threat Status will know we've done a lot of work with L3 Harris. Guy Taylor has done an influencers video with Ed Zoyce, president of Space and Airborne Systems at L3 Harris. Ed Zoyce was also a panelist at our Golden Dome event last year. I interviewed some L3 Harris leaders on camera when they unveiled their Wolfpack system not long ago. We've had Tom Gould and Rob Matrevsky from L3 on this podcast just a few months ago. So, as far as L3 goes, they're obviously a very professional company and a very integral part at this point of the U.S. defense industrial base. And it's important to point out that the government does take stakes in private companies, investments in private companies in several different forms and fashions. InQtel, for example, an investment firm chartered by the CIA, frequently invests in startup companies. But look, I think I would kind of be derelict in my duty in some respects if I didn't raise some questions about how this is actually going to work. I mean, who's going to represent the government at shareholders meetings? Is the defense secretary going to be there? Are there mechanisms in place to avoid conflicts of interest if, for example, in the future, there's another company that can build the same solid rocket motors at a better price? The Pentagon now literally has a financial stake in directing contracts to this new company that it partially owns. I'm curious what you're hearing, John, because I've heard some folks say L3 deserves credit for kind of understanding which way the wind is blowing with the Trump administration and the ways in which it wants to transform the government's interaction with the defense industry and how L3 as a company can profit from that. Nothing wrong with that. But people have questions, I think, about what this actually is going to look like in practice. What are you hearing on your end about this, John?
There's a call between Michael Duffy, the Undersecretary of War, and Chris Kubas, the Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of L3 Harris, with some media folks, sat in on that. And I mean, first off, address the elephant in the room, something, right, that you brought up there. It doesn't feel normal for the government to be investing this much money into a private company, right? As you pointed out, it isn't unprecedented, but it is sort of taking a much larger step in that direction than has historically been done. And the two of them tried to address some of those concerns. The CEO, he was of L3, he was very much pushing on this idea that L3 will maintain itself as an independent company, that the missile defense IPO that's going to spin off as part of this deal is also going to maintain that independence. And then, Mr. Duffy also sort of pushed on this idea of there's still going to be independence between the two. The government is looking for a return on investment through this public offering, but they are going to try to maintain that competitive nature in the marketplace, right? So one of the things that Duffy pointed out was they're still in talks with Lockheed Martin. They're still in talks with a lot of other companies, right? Anduril just hopped in, not so much on the larger end for these solid rocket motors, but on the small end for solid rocket motors. And they want to see that competition, or at least that's what he said on this call, right? Is that they're very much still trying to foster that competition. But the main thrust of the investment, they said, was to increase production capacity, modernize facilities. They're looking for like long-term resilience in this product line. And I said, well, I went to the groundbreaking down in Camden, Arkansas for L3 for the new solid rocket motor facility. And one of the things that got told to me was that L3 is doing a lot of investment in their subcontractors, effectively, right? The guys and gals making the chemicals that go into these rockets. And I said, well, is the government's investment part of that? And the response I got was kind of mixed. Essentially, Mr. Duffy was like, well, we're pretty hands off. The company can do what they need to do with this $1 billion stake. And L3 said, yes, it's our responsibility to, give capital where it's needed to sort of juice the signal, right? Increase the signal, the demand signal for these chemicals, which then become the solid rocket motors, which then become the weapons. And so there definitely is a little bit of separation, but yeah, the terms of the contract are still a little bit unclear. Whether or not the government's going to actually, as you put it, have like a seat on the board. That seems to not be something that will happen in the future. They seem to essentially be like a state, a step back shareholder, right? Someone that a silent partner or a silent voice, right? But the idea that yeah, the government has invested $1 billion into this private company that they are then going to contract weapons from. That's just the facts of the matter.
Yeah. We talk about this in the show a lot. There's so many levers that the Trump administration is trying to pull to influence where the defense industry goes and what it does and how much it produces in a whole variety of ways, whether you're talking about, taking a stake in NVIDIA to produce microchips, or now, they're talking about we're going to have a $1.5 trillion defense budget on one hand, but on the other hand, you have to limit CEO pay to $5 million. You can't do stock buybacks and dividends at the moment. So there's just all kinds of measures being taken across the federal government, including, at the Pentagon, to sort of steer the defense industry toward where the Trump administration wants it to go. I think this is another example of that.
Yeah, that's right. And I just want to be clear, because I think it is sort of the obvious question, right? Duffy out and out said it. CEO of L3Harris out and out said it. The Department of War will not have a direct role in the company's management through this stake, right? That $1 billion is part of a much larger pot that L3Harris feels like they need to be able to invest and to actually boost the supply chain to be able to meet this increased demand signal. But yeah, still a lot of questions about the eaches of how this contract, the terms of this agreement are going to play out for this public offering and for essentially the return on investment from $1 billion from the U.S. taxpayer.
Yeah, it's interesting. We're going to obviously watch where this goes from here. John, quickly, before we get to our great interview with Steve Pykett, I want to talk about Iran and the protests there and whether or not this ends up drawing the U.S. into military action. It's tough to get exact figures here. I saw reports today saying that as many as 12,000 are feared dead in Iran amid a really aggressive and violent government crackdown on demonstrators who are protesting against the dire economic conditions in Iran and more generally against the theocratic regime in Tehran. There have been, of course, a lot of protests throughout Iran's recent history. This one's partly different for several reasons, including that the regime has been a little bit exposed on the world stage by Israeli strikes and U.S. strikes targeting nuclear facilities last year. The regime, despite years and years of tough talk, was completely unable to stop those attacks and kind of got embarrassed, militarily speaking. So I think that's exposed to its citizens, who are sort of funneled government-approved news in a lot of cases, how weak the regime is, contrary to what they often say publicly. President Trump has threatened more military strikes to help the protesters and stop the killing by the Iranian government, alleged killing by the Iranian government. What I'm hearing is there's a real debate inside the administration over whether any kind of U.S. intervention would actually work. I mean, this wouldn't be like the strikes in Nigeria or even the Maduro capture in Venezuela a few weeks ago. It's hard to envision a scenario, at least to me, in which the U.S. doesn't get drawn into some sort of nation-building exercise here if our military intervention topples the regime. Our colleague Vaughn Cockane dove into that aspect with some great reporting this week. Go read that at WashingtonTimes.com. And if the regime isn't overthrown, then what have we actually done in the long run? So it's a tough one. I became convinced that it was inevitable that we would do something in Venezuela. We'll see about Iran. It's a different ballgame in some ways because I don't know if the objective is quite as clear. One last thing, John, I'm curious to get your take on this because I know you and I are both fascinated sort of by Elon Musk and SpaceX role in the defense industrial base going forward as well. But SpaceX and Starlink has been deeply involved with trying to get internet access to the Iranians who have had their internet essentially blacked out, cut through a crackdown by the Iranian government. Elon Musk stepped in, Starlink, provided internet to Iranian protesters, but now Iran is apparently using GPS spoofing and other means to try to cut that Starlink access. Essentially, there's kind of a cat and mouse game going on here between Iran and Starlink. Iran, interestingly enough, seems to be having a little bit more success than Russia did than in Ukraine, which also relied heavily on Starlink. I think it's worth watching, John, how this aspect kind of plays out because, in major 21st century conflicts, or in this case, an instance of major national protest, I think we're going to see this kind of thing more. Battles over internet access, over communication, data dominance, if you will. I think that's something that could become, I think, a feature of just about every major conflict we might see here in the 21st century going forward.
100% agree. The more that you see folks actually using, open source intelligence, right, actually getting fed from the public, the more that internet access is going to be sort of an on-off switch as a domain of warfare for sure. And a fascinating sort of case study for us right now from the U.S. perspective, right? Yes, Starlink, a huge capability, very useful in Ukraine, now sort of being offered in Iran. But yeah, they were able to essentially do a ground-based, from sort of the surface level understanding that we have thus far, a ground-based EW attack to stop internet access there. So that's going to be something that, like, I know I'm watching, and then I know a lot of experts are watching to see how that plays out and what can be done sort of to counterpoint that as well.
And we are joined now by Steve Pykett, the CEO of Fairbanks Morse Defense, a company with a long and storied history in the defense industry, providing all kinds of key components. I'm looking at a graph right here in front of me: controllers, actuators, hoists, electrical systems, hardware, propellers, all kinds of stuff you all do there for the Navy, the Coast Guard, others as well. Steve, it is a pleasure. Thanks so much for joining us here on the Threat Status Podcast.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks for having me.
So you took this job back in May, so a little more than 8 months here on the job. Before that, I believe you've been at L3 Harris, Rolls-Royce, elsewhere. So kind of a two-part question to get us into things. Why did you take this job at Fairbanks Morse? And when you kind of look out today at what's a pretty rapidly changing face of the defense industry and where it's going in the future, where does this company, Fairbanks Morse, sort of fit into that as you see it going forward?
Sure, yeah, I'll do my best to get there. So I've got I'm an engineer at heart. I started my career at Rolls-Royce as a design engineer, transitioned into manufacturing, kind of built a career on the back of solving problems, because that's kind of what keeps me, getting up in the morning. Transitioned to a US role back in 2019, again, but general management, and then moved into a president role, running investment casting for PCC. And then I kind of got to the stage of my career where I wanted to run my own business and build something. So I very deliberately was looking for a CEO role, and ideally a business that was on that journey of building something. And if you know the history of Fairbanks Morse, it's got a 200-year-old history. Started making industrial scales, made windmills, made locomotive engines, refrigerators, televisions. But for the last 100 or so years, certainly since World War I, has been a key supplier to the US Navy, Coast Guard, making medium-speed diesel engines. And then about 5 years ago, ownership transitioned into private equity, and the journey that the business has been on since then has been pretty incredible. We announced last December our 15th acquisition, and that's kind of led to the graphic you see in front of you, where we now have gone from medium-speed diesel engine supplier to US Navy to a myriad of mission-critical, safety of life kind of HM&E equipment to the US Navy Coast Guard. So I was very keen to get on into that journey, continue to help build the business. I think, honestly, it was kind of coincidence, but I think that timing coincided with the generational investment into the US Navy and Coast Guard. And I think Fairbanks Morse is in a perfect position to kind of support that rebuilding effort. Not just the rebuilding effort, but the sustainment effort of vessels as they're deployed, which is kind of a key part of our business as well.
Right. Okay. I want to ask about sort of U.S. naval supremacy, if you want to call it that, today. I mean, and President Trump kind of gave voice recently to what some would see as a sort of a decline in that. We talked about the new Trump-class battleships and why we need the Golden Fleet and all of that stuff, which we can maybe get into a little bit later. But broadly speaking, how do you see sort of the U.S. standing today in terms of naval power? Are there drop-offs, that tangible drop-offs that you can see? And I guess more importantly than that is the gap between the U.S. and adversaries closing, in your view, in terms of naval power?
I mean, I see, you said it yourself. I think certainly in terms of quantity of hulls in the ocean, certainly our adversaries are catching up. I think there's a debate to be had around quality versus quantity, and I certainly would say for the equipment that we supply, and even our peers, we have developed over, as I said, over 100 years, a quality of product that we know that our sailors can really rely on. I don't know, but I don't believe the same can be said for our adversaries. So I think we have to be continually cautious. We have to certainly catch up and help build the industrial base so that we can continue to grow holes in the ocean. But I think we also need to be as focused on sustaining those vessels that are out there today. And again, Fairbanks Morse specifically offers both of those things. We are very focused on offering our OE solutions, and we are very focused on maintaining and providing a service to the Navy, Coast Guard, to make sure those solutions continue to operate when they're needed.
Okay. On the Golden Fleet, quickly, it's fair to say there's more questions than answers in terms of these Trump-class battleships that the Golden Fleet, as the president said. Just from an industry point of view, what have you heard so far? What are you looking at with where that's going to go from here?
Yeah, I think everyone's still in discovery mode. I think certainly events like today, this week, are helping with more clarity. Certainly the big battleship Trump class is something certainly Fairbanks Morse is very excited about. Again, we believe the products we've developed and continue to develop will certainly be very closely aligned with the requirements of that battleship. So we're very engaged in making sure we can be the first there to kind of offer our solutions. I think outside of that, the implications we got from the Secretary of the Navy yesterday, well, that the Golden Fleet is going to be very UAV heavy.
Yeah.
And again, we see that with some of the new entrants into the industry. We are still not largely in that space, but certainly with regard to our M&A appetite, certainly something we're not afraid of entering at the right time.
Okay.
And it's like with many new technologies, we still think there'll be winners and losers in that race, and we want to make sure we enter at the right time.
Okay. I want to ask you kind of this is going to sound like an incredibly simple question to somebody in your position, but I think it's something that listeners and readers of the Washington Times would probably wonder about. The U.S. is operating in a lot of different theaters with maritime assets. We just had operations in Nigeria and Venezuela within about 10 days of each other that relied partly on ships. And of course, we could talk about the Houthis in Yemen, Somalia, the Arctic, the Middle East. When you guys are making the stuff that you make to make these ships functional to do the missions they need to do, how do you make it work in basically any naval environment? I mean, the waters of the Middle East and the Arctic are very different. I mean, are there differences depending on where in the world this is going to go, or is water?
No, there certainly are differences, and again, I think it speaks to your earlier question. Many of our products have to be qualified to an incredibly rigorous standard. Such a rigorous standard that I'll be frank, many U.S. companies won't compete in that space because it's such a high bar. We often have to select specific materials that are low temperature capable because they're operating in sub-zero temperatures. We have to battle harden many of our products that commercially that wouldn't be required because they have to withstand shock if they're deployed in active operations. No, there very much is some sensitivity around where and the type of operation the vessel's designed for, and I think that's what differentiates a business like Fairbanks Morse from what might be more of a commercial shipping operation, where they don't have to be prepared to withstand such an arduous operation.
Right. Okay. I want to ask you sort of about global networks and supply chains. You mentioned that the global network you have, quote, ensures access to critical components even for legacy systems, unquote. So there's a push, as you well know, to sort of sever supply chain reliance on stuff from China or other adversaries. It seems like this is kind of becoming a national imperative for this administration and possibly kind of going forward. I mean, where are you all on that at Fairbanks Morse in terms of supply chain?
We have always been very much in our legacy businesses. We have a U.S. supply chain. Do we have some of our commercial off-the-shelf componentry that we can source in lower cost countries? We certainly do. But we don't source anything in China because we recognize that would be a reliance that we wouldn't want to have to depend on. And I think the earlier part of your question, there's an old saying: amateurs talk tactics, professionals talk logistics. Certainly with the amount of operations you referred to and the ever-changing landscape, Fairbanks Morse is very invested in making sure we operate our service availability in areas where our customer needs us.
Yeah.
So we have a very dominant position in the US coastal regions because that's where most of our customers operate in terms of either building new ships or repairing and maintaining old ones. But we're also conscious that, and we are, as we speak, in discussions about expanding our network outside of the US in Indo-Pacific, because we recognize that might be an area where we have to be able to provide, service and repair support for the Navy. And in fact, one of our recent acquisitions we announced in December effectively buys us an office in Taiwan and in Australia, recognizing that we need to be looking outside of the continental US to provide support for the Navy.
How do you balance? So I'm just curious from the financial point of view, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I would assume that it would be cheaper in some instances to get stuff supply chain wise from China. So where do you balance sort of the cost versus?
Certainly is, and I'll be honest, it is an ongoing debate dynamic with our prime customers. So for a company like Fairbanks Morse, we have very, very close relationships with the Navy and Coast Guard. They set the ultimate requirements, but in reality, many of our contracts are deployed from shipyards. And shipyards are commercial entities, they want to get the best value for money. And very, very often there's a disconnect there, or there's certainly some tension in the system because they want sometimes the cheapest solution, and in reality, the battle-hardened, shot-qualified solution is not always the cheapest solution. So we have to continue to kind of work that with our customers. I think we find a healthy balance.
Yep.
Certainly, if those requirements didn't exist, we could offer cheaper solutions. But we focus on providing our sailors with the most reliable, mission critical pieces of equipment. So it's not a direction we're heading. And again, from a Chinese supply chain, not a concern we have because we have no exposure.
Yeah. So it's an old sports saying, the greatest ability is availability. You want the stuff that's actually going to work when it's out there versus trying to save a couple bucks on the front end.
Absolutely. And again, I'll be honest, we've come out in terms of how we operate and trying to solve the Navy's biggest problems. What's been made very clear to us in recent times is, schedule is king. And in fact, in many cases, that the customer's prepared to pay more if they can have a reliable schedule or a shortened schedule. So you saw out on the stand, I think, probably as you arrived, our welding solution, and that's a really good example of where we've got a known problem with the conditions that we ask some of our welding approved welders to operate in. We have an opportunity to shorten cycle time, and we bring technology to bear with automation and AI to not replace that welder, because they still need to be there to follow up with special cause events, to install and train the robotics. But we can now take what would have been a 5-week process of manual welding in some of the most arduous conditions, asking a welder to sit inside an engine casing, inside a ship. We can now remove that threat and take it from a 5-week process to a 5-day process. Yeah. And we have very similar examples where, in fact, probably one of our best examples is our pit stop strategy, which speaks for itself. We shamelessly stole that from NASCAR or F1, depending on your preference.
Yeah, I just watched F1 on Apple TV recently, so it's very much top of mind right now.
I'm a big fan. So the conventional wisdom or process for maintaining a large medium-speed diesel engine is to open and inspect. So the ship comes in for its availability, you send your crew in there, you open the engine up, you inspect it, discover what's wrong, then you order those parts. There's a 180-day lead time for the ordering process. Yeah. And then there's the pick a time, 6-12-month lead time of ordering the components. So that open and inspect process, worst case scenario, can take between 12 to 18 months from start to finish. We came to the Navy and they were clearly aware of that dynamic. We said, look, we can offer you a better solution. We can shorten that lead time dramatically by offering a pit stop solution where we worked with the Diesel Council of America. We said, look, these are all the components you need for a midlife diesel engine upgrade. Yeah. We'll put them into a Connex box. We'll sequence them so we know when those operators need to pull those components, and we can take a 18-month lead time process to 25 days, and we've done that successfully twice through 2025. So I think back to what that will drive is that we're now in a position where we can effectively use an expeditionary process wherever the Navy may be positioned around the globe, send this system into a foreign port potentially, and if it's required as part of making that vessel available in a conflict scenario, we can do that in 25 days.
Yeah.
So I think that's kind of where we focus our efforts in terms of ensuring wherever the Navy needs to be, that they have reliable, dependable equipment.
Okay. Last question, Steve, to wrap up. Look, you're the CEO of a major defense company, so I want to ask you sort of about the changing nature in terms of the government's relationship with the Pentagon and requirements and procurement and acquisition and all that good stuff. Defense Secretary Hegseth is out on this Arsenal of Freedom tour as we sit here today. He was just in Texas yesterday at SpaceX and Lockheed Martin, talking about getting rid of JSIDs, for example, and changing requirement systems and all of that. And just this week, we also saw the Pentagon take a $1 billion stake in a new L3 Harris spinoff to build solid rocket motors. So a lot of stuff is changing, as we kind of talked about at the outset. Where do you come down on all of this? The arsenal of freedom, getting rid of JSIDs, acquisition and procurement reform. Do you think from an industry perspective, the U.S., the DoD, DoW is sort of headed in the right direction in terms of reform?
I think generally speaking, we're in favour. We certainly see lots of change. Change right now is definitely a constant.
Right.
So kind of dealing with that obviously generates churn, but it's for all the right reasons, we think. Certainly the additional funding we're seeing flow through the system. The desire to get more agile, more velocity is something, I'll be honest, is in Fairbanks Morse DNA. In fact, one of our 3 cultural kind of tenets is velocity. So it's something we're very supportive of. I think the one thing that we will continue to try and encourage is we still want to make sure we're supplying high quality, the best equipment that the sailors deserve. Mm-hmm. So we don't want to make shortcuts that compromise the integrity of the finished vessel. But I don't think that's what's being expected. I think we just want to make sure we kind of we get out of our own way in terms of some of the bureaucracy that exists still in, as I said, this kind of 180-day lead time I described. That's just to order a part, not to get the part, just to order it. 180 days. That's
too long.
We should be better than that. So I think we see it as a positive movement in the right direction. So I think the one thing that again we continue to monitor closely is again the generational improvement in the funding is great. Getting that to trickle down through the contracting vehicles into the shipyards, into the U.S. industrial base, still is something that the jury is still out, for me at least.
Right.
But all we can do, I think, is continue to be a good supplier to the U.S. Navy, Coast Guard. And we're confident that when that funding does arrive, we'll be in a position to kind of support the Navy and the Coast Guard and what they need.
Okay, great. Steve Pykett, CEO of Fairbanks Morse, thank you so much. Really enjoyed that.
Thanks, Ben. Great to be here.
And it's time now for Threat of the Week, our weekly segment here in the show where we each identify a threat, whether it's here at home, domestically, or in some corner of the world that we think is impacting U.S. national security right now, this week, as you listen to the show. And John, my threat of the week is a United States Congress that is unwilling or unable to assert its constitutional authority when it comes to matters of war. This has been true, of course, for quite a while. I think most listeners of this show know we haven't declared war as a country since World War II, but in that time we've had the Korean War, Vietnam, Panama, 2 Iraq wars, Afghanistan, Syria, Yemen, Somalia, Nigeria, Venezuela, Niger. We can go on and on. Now, some of that, of course, is rightfully covered by the authorizations for use of military force, one of which was passed back in the 90s, 2 passed after 9/11. A lot of military activity isn't covered by those, I would argue, but at least there's something on the books. Congress has made some progress recently on repealing 2 of those AUMFs related to Iraq. The broader counterterrorism one, we'll see. Maybe that's just kind of around forever. But this week we saw Congress once again take a swing at curbing what some would call unchecked presidential power on this issue, and they whiffed. Republican Senators Josh Hawley of Missouri and Todd Young of Indiana apparently flipped their votes at the last minute and helped to stop a war powers resolution that essentially would have blocked President Trump from taking more direct military action in Venezuela without congressional approval. Their positions created a 50-50 tie, which Vice President J.D. Vance then broke. 3 Republicans, Rand Paul, Lisa Murkowski, and Susan Collins, supported that resolution. There is, of course, a very legitimate legal debate about presidential authority here. We mentioned the AUMF related to terrorism and terror groups. We've had legal scholars on this show recently talking about Article 2 and inherent authority that presidents have in terms of using the U.S. military. And maybe you think that U.S. military action in Venezuela was and is good for U.S. national security. But here's where I personally kind of have a problem with this, John. Senator Young said that he switched his position after Secretary of State Marco Rubio assured him that the president would seek authorization from Congress if he were to pursue, quote, major military operations in Venezuela, unquote. In other words, he's taking the administration's word for it. And politics aside, because God knows this applies to administrations of both parties throughout history, that may not necessarily be a good idea. There's a reason that Congress is supposed to have power here. They increasingly don't, and that's why I think it represents a threat right now.
Well, look, and I think, you bring up a good point, right? Which is this idea of, well, we'll let you know and we'll ask Congress if we're going to take larger military action. Whether or not you agree with the political angle on it, both sides of the aisle were pretty straightforward in acknowledging that they did not receive a lot of information ahead of that January 3rd raid to capture Maduro. So the idea that, that's a limited military that you're starting to get into a lot of gray zone where the power of Congress is definitely in question. For my threat of the week, it's warfare on multiple fronts. We've seen some reporting about President Trump being offered options to conduct some sort of military strike in Iran in support of protesters. He said that this is the moment for freedom for them, that he wants to support them, et cetera. And yet we do have the majority of our Atlantic fleet off of the coast of Venezuela, exactly what we were just talking about there. That poses a significant challenge. You can't just magic move parts of the Navy around the world. Now, it's been acknowledged by experts and others that we definitely still have resources in the region. We definitely still have options in the region. And I don't want to take away from that at all. I have not gotten the reporting to know what those options are that the president's being given, but I have every faith and confidence in the U.S. service member to get the job done, right? Like there's going to be options on the table. That being said, the Admiral Dale Claude, who is the CNO for the Navy, he said that, if the president needs more options from the Navy in the Middle East, he's going to get some pushback. He effectively said, I think, here we go, quote, the Ford, from its capability perspective, would be an invaluable option for any military thing the president wants to do. But if it requires an extension, it's going to get some pushback from the office. He's basically just saying, look, we can't be in two places at once. Guys that are actually on that boat, guys and gals that are on that boat, they are going to need refit. The equipment needs refit. We have to sail across the Atlantic to get there. Those are just hard constraints. There's no way to sort of make those go away. So when you're trying to balance these different options, I think that idea of, multi-front conflict, especially with the number of strikes we've carried out in all the disparate parts of the world in the past 12 months, starts to be a real look and a real thing to consider. So that's my threat of the week.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it's, when we talk about sort of the U.S. being stretched thin, and stretched thin may be, a little too strong of a way to put it, but this is a great example of that. So I think you're certainly right to highlight it. So thank you for that. And a huge thanks to Steve Pykett from Fairbanks Morse for that great interview, and everybody from the Surface Navy Association for making John and myself and all of us at Threat Status feel very welcome at their annual symposium this week. And most of all, of course, a huge thanks to all of you, our listeners. Please go ahead, hit that subscribe button, share with all of your friends, and we'll be back next week on the Threat Status Podcast.